Saint Petersburg. November, 1887. The fog crept through the cracks in the windows as though the city itself were breathing something rotten. That was the feeling Detective Arkady Semyonovich Volkov carried every time he was summoned to a crime scene before dawn. That the city was alive, that it knew things men had not yet discovered. It was 3 in the morning when someone knocked at his door. Volkov was a man of 52, lean as a winter branch, with brown eyes so deep that people looked away when he fixed them with his gaze. Not because he was threatening. It was the opposite. It was because he seemed to see too much. As though behind those eyes there was a machine that never stopped, cataloging every detail, every hesitation, every word spoken in the wrong place. He put on his black overcoat and descended the stairs without hurry. The messenger was young, no more than 17, and trembling, but not from the cold. "Mr. Volkov," the boy said, "Inspector Golitsyn requests that you come immediately to number 14 Nevsky Street. A man has been found dead." Volkov picked up his hat. "Dead how?" he asked. The boy blinked, confused by the question. Dead, sir." "No," Volkov said patiently, the way one explains something to a child. "There is an enormous difference between a man who has died and a man who has been killed. Which of the two did you see?" The boy swallowed hard. There was a great deal of blood, sir." Volkov nodded. "Then he was killed. Good. At least that much is simple." Number 14. Nevsky Street was one of the most elegant buildings in the district. 4 floors of gray stone, windows with gilded frames, an iron gate with the initials KM engraved at its center. It belonged to the Mereshkov family, one of the oldest and wealthiest in St. Petersburg. When Volkov arrived, there were 3 police carriages outside and a small crowd of curious neighbors that the November cold had not yet managed to disperse. Inspector Golitsyn waited at the entrance, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache who always seemed mildly irritated by Volkov's very existence. "You took your time," said Golitsyn. "I took exactly the time I needed," Volkov replied, not looking at him, already scanning the building's facade. "Who is the victim?" "Konstantin Mereshkov, 58 years old, heir to the Mereshkov fortune, widower, found by his manservant at 2:30 in the morning in the 3rd-floor study." "Who found him?" "The manservant, a man called Pavel Ilyich. Says he heard a noise, came upstairs and found his master." "What kind of noise?" Golitsyn frowned. "A gunshot, Volkov. A gunshot." "Ah!" Volkov finally looked at the inspector. "So there was a weapon?" "There was." "In the victim's hand or on the floor?" A pause. "On the floor, about 5 feet from the body." Volkov smiled faintly. The kind of smile Golitsyn hated, because it meant the detective was already 3 steps ahead of everyone. "Interesting," said Volkov. "Let's go up." Konstantin Mereshkov's study was vast and dark, lined floor to ceiling with books. There was a cold fireplace, an oak writing desk covered in papers, and at the center of the Persian rug, a dead man. Konstantin Mereshkov lay on his back, arms slightly open, as though he had fallen asleep in the middle of an embrace. The bullet wound was in his chest, on the left side. There was blood, yes, but less than Volkov had expected. The man's face was curiously serene, almost at peace. Volkov crouched beside the body without touching it, and remained there for nearly 2 minutes, simply looking. Golitsyn watched from the doorway, impatient. "Well?" said the inspector. "Suicide? Murder?" Volkov rose slowly and walked to the window. It was closed but not locked. He opened it, looked down, 3 floors of stone, and closed it again. "Neither," said Volkov. Golitsyn huffed. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't know yet." Volkov turned to the manservant Pavel Ilyich, who stood pressed against the far wall, pale as paper. "You! Tell me about the noise." Pavel Ilyich was a man of around 40, lean, with large worker's hands and red-rimmed eyes that suggested he had been crying, or pretending to cry. "I was asleep in the back room, sir," he said, his voice unsteady. "I heard the shot. I woke up. I ran upstairs. How long did it take you to get up there?" 2, perhaps 3 minutes, sir. I had to dress myself, light a candle." "Why dress yourself?" Volkov interrupted softly. "If you heard a gunshot from the floor above, where your master slept, why did you take the time to get dressed?" The manservant opened his mouth, closed it. I don't know, sir. Instinct, I suppose. Volkov nodded slowly, as though the answer were perfectly satisfactory. But his expression said something else entirely. The following morning, Volkov summoned every member of the household who had slept under that roof on the night of the crime. There were 3. Natasha Mereshkova, the eldest daughter, 32 years old, dark hair, green eyes, a weary beauty that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of frustrated expectations. She had returned to her father's house 3 weeks earlier, after a marriage that had lasted only 2 years before ending in scandal. Her husband had fled with an actress and half the Mereshkov family jewels. Dmitry Mereshkov, the younger son, 26 years old, fair-haired, anxious, with the manner of a man who had spent his life trying to appear more important than he was. He owed money, that much Volkov learned in 20 minutes of conversation with the neighbors. A great deal of money, the kind of debt that makes men desperate. And Father Alexei, not a blood relation, but by all that Volkov soon discovered, perhaps the person closest to Konstantin in recent years. An Orthodox priest of around 50, white-bearded, with blue eyes of a deeply unsettling calm. He had dined with Konstantin that evening, the last person to see him alive, according to the manservant Pavel. Volkov gathered them in the sitting room at 10 in the morning, while snow began to fall outside, and Konstantin Mereshkov's body was carried away by the medical examiner's men. He stood before them and looked at each of them for a long moment without speaking. Natasha crossed her arms. Dmitry drummed his fingers on his knee. Father Alexei folded his hands and closed his eyes as if in prayer. Someone in this room killed a man, Volkov said at last. And that person believes they were clever enough that I will never find out. I simply want you to know, they are wrong. Volkov decided to begin with Natasha, not because she was the most likely suspect, but because she was the most controlled, and controlled people reveal more when confronted with the unexpected. He found her alone in the library an hour later. She stood at the window, looking out at the snow with her arms crossed over her chest, a posture Volkov recognized as that of someone holding themselves together, literally. "Miss Mereshkova," he said, "where were you at 2 in the morning?" "In my room," she replied without turning. "Asleep. Can anyone confirm that?" "I live alone on the 2nd floor. There is no one to confirm it." A pause, nor to deny it. Volkov walked slowly through the library, running his fingers along the spines of the books without pulling any from the shelf. "You returned to this house 3 weeks ago," he said. "After 2 years of marriage. May I ask why?" Natasha finally turned. There was something in her eyes. Not grief, but the place beyond grief where people arrive when they have cried so much that the tears have dried up. "Because there was nowhere else," she said simply. "My husband took everything. And my father was the only one who still answered when I called." "Did they have a good relationship, you and Konstantin?" "We did." The past tense cut the air. In recent weeks, less so. He was different, distracted. Sometimes I would walk into a room and he would stop writing immediately, cover the papers with his hands, as though he were keeping a secret. "Do you know what secret?" "No." But there was a half-second hesitation before the answer. Just half a second. But Volkov noted it. "All I know is that on the night he died, he came to my room at 11 o'clock. He knocked, came in, stood looking at me for a moment as though he were about to say something important, and then said only, 'Good night, Natasha. I love you,' and left." Volkov went still. "Did he do that often? Come to your room at night to tell you he loved you?" Natasha's eyes glistened. "No," she said. "My father was never a man for words like that. In 32 years, I could count on one hand the times he said it. Dmitry was more difficult. Not because he was more intelligent, it was in fact the opposite. He was difficult because he was afraid, and frightened people are unpredictable. Volkov found him in the back garden, despite the cold, smoking one cigarette after another with trembling fingers. Dmitry was the kind of handsome young man who would soon become a worn-out one. There was in him the seed of something that excess and anxiety would consume early. "Mr. Mereshkov," said Volkov. Dmitry spun around with wide eyes, the eyes of a cornered animal. "I didn't do anything," he said, before Volkov could open his mouth. "I didn't say you did. But you're thinking it." Dmitry threw his cigarette into the snow. "Everyone always thinks it. I'm the irresponsible son, The one who owes money. The one who never pleased his father. So when something happens, how much do you owe? Volkov interrupted. Dmitri shut his mouth. That's none of your business. It is exactly my business when a wealthy man dies and his indebted son is in the same building. A long silence. Then, with the resignation of someone who knows a lie won't work. 18,000 rubles, said Dmitri, to 3 different creditors. The interest doubles every month. And your father knew. He knew part of it, not the full amount. Dmitri leaned back against the stone wall, as though his legs could no longer hold him. I went to speak with him a month ago. I asked for help. He said he wouldn't pay this time, that I had to learn the consequences of my own choices. A short, bitter laugh. Very fine words from a man who never had to learn anything because he inherited everything. You were angry. I was furious. Dmitri said it with a frankness that surprised Volkov. I said things I shouldn't have. I left, slamming the door. A pause. But I didn't come back at 2 in the morning to kill him. I was in my room drunk, with a bottle of cognac I'd found in the cabinet. If you need to check, the bottle is still there, nearly empty. Volkov looked at him for a long moment. Did you know about the new will? Dmitri's face went blank, the kind of genuine blankness that cannot be faked. What new will? That afternoon, Volkov visited the law office that handled Konstantin Merezhkov's affairs. The will had been altered 3 weeks earlier, precisely when Natasha had returned home. In the old version, the fortune was divided equally between the 2 children. In the new version, Natasha received 70%. Dmitri, the remaining 30, with one condition, that he settle all his debts within 6 months, or lose even that. The lawyer was a small, nervous man named Fyodor Blansky, who was visibly perspiring as Volkov read the document. When did Dmitri learn of the change? Volkov asked, without lifting his eyes from the paper. He didn't know, sir. Mr. Konstantin insisted on complete secrecy. But Miss Natasha knew. A pause that lasted 1 second too long. Yes, said Blansky. She was present when the document was signed. Volkov folded the paper carefully and returned it to the lawyer. Thank you, he said. You have been most helpful. Already at the door he turned. One last thing. Father Alexei, does he have any connection to the family's financial affairs? Blansky hesitated. Father Alexei is a beneficiary of a charitable fund administered by Mr. Konstantin, a considerable sum designated for his parish. And this fund remains in the new will? Yes, unchanged. Volkov walked out into the snow without another word. On the second night after the crime, Volkov spent 3 hours sitting at his desk with all his notes spread before him. And for the first time in many years, he saw nothing. There were 3 suspects with real motives. Natasha, who had received 70% of the inheritance and who, by her own admission, had been the last to see her father alive. That visit to her room at 11 o'clock. Why had Konstantin gone to his daughter at that hour, to say goodbye? Because he knew what was coming, or because she had gone to him first, and Volkov had only heard half the story. Dmitri, who owed 18,000 rubles and had had a violent argument with his father weeks before. The cognac bottle was an alibi too convenient, or convenient enough to be true, which was the problem with convenient alibis. And Father Alexei, whose unsettling calm could be that of an innocent man with genuine faith, or that of someone who had done something irreversible and had found peace with it. Volkov closed his eyes. There was something that didn't fit. Not in the suspects. In them, everything fit too well, which was exactly the problem. There was something in the crime itself that he had not yet seen correctly. The man's face was curiously serene, almost at peace. Why does a murdered man die with that expression? Unless it wasn't surprise. Unless it was relief. Volkov stood abruptly, grabbed his overcoat, and did something Golitsyn considered completely insane. He asked to sleep in the Merezhkov house. You want to sleep at the crime scene? Golitsyn said, incredulous. I want to understand the acoustics of the building, Volkov replied. He settled into a small guest room on the 2nd floor, directly below the study where Konstantin had died. He lay down fully dressed, eyes open in the dark, and listened. The house was old. It spoke. Creaking wood, wind in the chimneys, the settling of stones in the cold. Volkov knew these sounds. He had spent 40 years learning to hear them. At midnight, he heard footsteps, slow, careful, coming from the floor above. He rose without a sound, opened the bedroom door, and climbed the stairs in the dark, each foot placed at the edge of the steps, where the wood did not creak. The study had a candle burning, and there was Father Alexei, kneeling in the exact spot where Konstantin had fallen, hands clasped, head bowed, murmuring in the lowest of voices. Volkov stood in the doorway and waited. After a long moment, the priest said, without turning, "I knew you would come." Volkov entered the study and closed the door behind him. He pulled up a chair and sat before the priest, who finally rose from the floor and took the leather armchair that had belonged to Konstantin. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other in the trembling candlelight. "Are you going to arrest me?" asked Father Alexei. "That depends on what you have to tell me," replied Volkov. The priest closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something different in them. Not the unsettling calm of before, but something older, heavier. "I met Konstantin 30 years ago," he began. "We were young. He was a law student. I had not yet taken orders. We were friends. The kind of friendship that youth permits and adulthood destroys." Volkov said nothing. He simply listened. Konstantin was a man of great ideals when young. He believed in justice, in redemption, in the power of repentance. Dostoevsky was his favorite writer. He had read Crime and Punishment 5 times. He used to say he understood Raskolnikov better than anyone alive. Volkov raised an eyebrow slightly. "And then?" he said. "And then he became rich." The priest said it with a quiet bitterness, the way one describes an inevitable disease. "And the wealthy rarely keep their ideals. The family fortune came from businesses that would not survive the scrutiny of daylight. Workers exploited, land taken, men destroyed. That is not a new crime in Saint Petersburg," said Volkov. "No, but there was one particular crime." The priest drew a slow breath. 30 years ago, a man named Grigory Ivanovich was accused of theft by Konstantin's father. Tried and convicted. He spent 12 years in Siberia. A pause. He was innocent. Konstantin knew it. Konstantin's father knew it. The theft had been committed by one of the household's own employees, but it was more convenient to blame Grigory. Volkov went still. "Grigory returned from Siberia 6 months ago," the priest continued. "A destroyed man. His wife had died while he was imprisoned. His son had grown up without a father. When he came back, he sought out Konstantin and asked for reparation, not money, but a public acknowledgement, a confession. And Konstantin refused. Konstantin refused. And Grigory," the priest closed his eyes again, "Grigory was found dead in his boarding house room 2 weeks later. They said it was his heart. But I knew Grigory. He was a man who had survived 12 years in Siberia. He was not the type to die of a heart attack." The silence that followed was long and dense as the snow outside. "So you killed Konstantin for Grigory," said Volkov at last. The priest opened his eyes. "No," he said, and there was something in his voice, a strange, almost serene conviction, that made Volkov lean slightly forward. "I did not kill Konstantin." "Then who did?" said Volkov. Father Alexei rose and walked to the writing desk. He opened the bottom drawer and withdrew a yellowed envelope, which he extended to Volkov. "Konstantin gave me this on the night he died, during dinner. He asked me to keep it and only open it if something happened to him." Volkov took the envelope. Inside were 3 sheets covered in a nervous, uneven hand, the writing of a man composing in haste or in fear. It was a confession, not the confession of a murder, something far more complex. Volkov read the 3 pages twice. Then he folded the paper, placed it in the inside pocket of his overcoat, and stared at the candle flame for a long moment. "Konstantin knew he was going to die," he said at last. "Yes," said the priest. "He told me during dinner. He said he had discovered something about the family that placed him in danger. He asked me to stay in the house that night, not to leave. But you left." A long pause. "I was called back to the parish, an emergency, a parishioner in grave condition." The priest closed his eyes. "When I returned, it was nearly 2 in the morning. I heard the shot as I came in through the back door." Volkov stood abruptly. "You entered through the back door? Not the main entrance?" "I didn't want to wake anyone. And Pavel Ilyich, the manservant, his room is at the back of the house. Yes, but Pavel Ilyich said he heard the shot and took 2 to 3 minutes to come upstairs because he had to dress and light a candle. Volkov was on his feet now, pacing the study. But if you entered through the back door, you would have passed through the corridor where the manservant's room is. Did you see light? Hear any sounds? The priest considered. The corridor was dark, silent. Then Pavel Ilyich was awake before the shot, said Volkov, and his voice had taken on a different quality now, sharp, cutting. He was awake, dressed, with a candle, which means it was not the gunshot that woke him. He already knew what had happened. It was 2 a.m. when Volkov woke Pavel Ilyich. The manservant opened his door with eyes swollen from sleep, or from a convincing imitation of sleep, and looked at the detective with a confused expression. "Mr. Volkov, at this hour, I want you to tell me the truth," said Volkov simply. "Not the version you prepared, the truth." Pavel stood motionless for a moment. Then something in his shoulders gave way, a tension that had been there from the beginning, which Volkov had noticed but not yet fully understood. "May I get dressed?" said Pavel. "You are already dressed," said Volkov. Pavel looked down. It was true. He was fully dressed, trousers, shirt, waistcoat. In the middle of the night, he let out a long breath. "Come in," he said. Pavel Ilyitch's room was small and neat, with the precision of someone who had learned that order is the only form of dignity available to those who have nothing. A bed, a table, a crucifix on the wall, a stack of books. Volkov looked at the books. Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov. "You read Dostoevsky," said Volkov. "My master gave me the books," said Pavel, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Many years ago, when I was young and had just entered his service." Volkov sat in the only chair. "Tell me about Grigory Ivanovich," he said. Pavel closed his eyes. "He was my father," said Pavel. 3 words. The room grew smaller. The silence that followed was the kind Volkov had learned to respect over 40 years of investigation, the kind that carries decades within it, that cannot be rushed without breaking. He waited. Pavel sat with his back turned for a long moment, staring at the wall. When he finally turned around, there was something on his face that Volkov rarely saw, not guilt, not fear, but exhaustion. The deep exhaustion of someone who has carried a weight for so long, they no longer know what it would feel like to be without it. "You already know," said Pavel. It was not a question. "I know you were awake before the shot," said Volkov. "I know the corridor was dark and silent when Father Alexei passed through. I know there was gunpowder residue in the right pocket of your waistcoat. A small amount, but enough for a man who knows what to look for." A pause. "What I don't know is why, and the why this time matters more than the what." Pavel sat on the edge of the bed with the slowness of a man far older than he was. "Do you know the name Grigory Ivanovich?" he said. Volkov went still. He knew it. It had appeared in the lawyer Blansky's records, the man who had been unjustly convicted 30 years earlier by Konstantin's father. "Tell me about him," said Volkov carefully. "He was my father. I was 6 years old when they took my father away," said Pavel. His voice was flat, controlled, like someone who has rehearsed these words many times in a dark room. "My mother died 3 years later. From grief, my aunt used to say, but I know it was from shame. The weight of being the wife of a criminal, even when the criminal is innocent, kills in ways medicine cannot name." He stopped, breathed. "I was raised by that aunt, a good woman, poor, who gave me food and had nothing more to offer. When I grew up, I needed work, and fate, or God, or the devil, I can no longer tell them apart, brought me to this house. You didn't know who the Mereshkovs were when you entered their service. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. The name was common enough." A long pause. "I found out in the 3rd year. I came across old documents in an archive Konstantin asked me to organize. My father's name was there, written by Konstantin's father's hand, with all the coldness of someone signing another man's death sentence. And you stayed," said Volkov. "And I stayed." Pavel looked at his own hands. "I spent weeks thinking about leaving. Then I thought, what for? Where would I go that was not equally unjust? At least here I could see, I could understand, I could wait. Wait for what?" Pavel raised his eyes to Volkov for the first time since he had begun speaking. "For him to confess," said Pavel simply. That was all I wanted. A confession. One word of responsibility. My father spent 12 years in Siberia for a crime he did not commit. He came back destroyed and died destroyed. I only wanted someone to say, "We did this. It was our fault." Volkov thought of the letter in the pocket of his overcoat. And when your father came back and went to speak with Konstantin sent him away. Pavel's voice dropped lower. I was standing outside the door. I heard everything. My father begged, not for money, not for revenge, only for words. And Konstantin said he owed nothing to anyone, that the family's affairs were none of his concern, that my father should leave before he called the police. And then your father died. 2 weeks later. A tear ran down Pavel's face, but he made no attempt to conceal it. The doctor said it was his heart, but I know it was the shame. The shame of returning from 12 years of hell only to discover that the world was exactly the same, that the guilty slept in soft beds while the innocent died in boarding house rooms. Volkov was quiet for a moment. Then you killed Konstantin. Pavel drew a slow breath. I entered the study at 2 in the morning. I had the key. I always had the key to everything in this house. I took the revolver from the drawer. Konstantin was reading. When he saw me, A pause. He wasn't afraid. That was the strangest thing. He looked at me, looked at the gun, and said, "So it's you, Pavel. I've been wondering when this moment would come." He knew who you were. He had known for years. He had found out by chance long ago, but he never said anything. Never dismissed me. Pavel frowned. I never understood why. Volkov took the envelope from his pocket. "Now you will," he said, and placed Konstantin's confession in the hands of the son of the man he had destroyed. Pavel read in silence. Volkov watched his face as he read, every line, every expression, every moment when something shifted behind his eyes. He had watched many people read things that changed their lives. It was always the same. The human face cannot hide the moment the world reorganizes itself. Konstantin Merezhkov's confession stated the following, that he had discovered 10 years earlier that Pavel Ilyich was Grigory's son, that he had considered dismissing him but could not bring himself to do it, because looking at Pavel was like looking at the living proof of his own sin, and he had learned, from the Dostoevsky novels he had read since youth, that fleeing guilt is the only thing worse than guilt itself, that he had tried in indirect ways to make amends, paying a generous wage, treating Pavel with respect, giving him books, petty, insufficient gestures for the weight of the crime he carried, that when Grigory had appeared at the door asking for acknowledgement, Konstantin had felt, for the first time in decades, the true weight of what he had done, and had panicked, had sent the man away, had acted once more as a coward, that when he learned of Grigory's death, he had begun writing the confession, the true one, the complete one, intended for publication, that he had hired a lawyer to ensure that, after his death, the document would reach the proper authorities and Grigory's son. And there was one last thing. He had altered his will not only to favor Natasha, he had created a separate fund, in Pavel Ilyич's name, equal to 30% of the entire Merezhkov fortune, enough to ensure that Pavel would never have to serve anyone again. The final lines of the confession read, "I cannot give back the years stolen from your father. I cannot give back the life your family lost. I can only confess and pay, knowing that no payment is enough. If you are reading this, Pavel, know that I knew who you were, and that I was ashamed of myself every single day from that moment on. This is not absolution, it is only the truth." Pavel lowered the pages. His eyes were dry now. There was something beyond tears on his face, an expression Volkov could not name at first and then recognized, the face of someone who had spent years starving for a thing and had finally received it, but too late for it to make the difference it should have. He was going to confess anyway, Pavel said quietly. He was going to publish everything. "Yes," said Volkov. "And Pavel looked at his own hands. "I killed him before he could." The silence was absolute. "He told me when I pointed the gun at him," said Pavel very slowly. "He said, 'Pavel, I have written everything down. It is with Father Alexei. The truth will come out regardless. You don't have to do this. And His voice broke for the first time. "I thought it was a lie. I thought it was a wealthy man trying to save his own life with words. And you fired. And I fired. Arkady Semyonovich Volkov arrested Pavel Ilyich at dawn. Golitsyn was satisfied. Case closed. Guilty party identified. Paperwork in order. For the inspector, it was simple. A manservant had murdered his master. A crime of envy or resentment. Justice would run its course. But as the handcuffs were placed on Pavel's wrists, Volkov noticed that the man did not resist. He said nothing. He only looked one last time at the room where he had slept for so many years, the books, the crucifix, the bed made with the precision of someone who had learned that order is the only dignity available to those who have nothing, and he went. Volkov walked home alone through the November snow. There was something that continued to trouble him, not a clue he had missed, but a question with no investigative answer, a philosophical question. The kind Golitsyn would never ask himself, and for that reason, Golitsyn slept well at night while Volkov lay awake. Konstantin Merezhkov had spent decades knowing he was guilty. He had tried to make amends in small, insufficient ways. In the end, he had attempted the only truly right thing, to confess, to publish, to accept the consequences. He had gone to his daughter's room at 11 o'clock to tell her he loved her, probably because he knew, at some level reason could not articulate, that this might be the last night. He had told Father Alexei his life was in danger. He had left everything prepared. And when Pavel had appeared in the study doorway with the revolver, Konstantin had said, "So it's you, Pavel. I've been wondering when this moment would come." He had not called for help. He had not cried out. He had simply waited. Was it possible, Volkov thought, that Konstantin Merezhkov had decided he deserved what was coming? Was it possible that at some level he himself could not name, he had let Pavel in? The revolver had been in the writing desk drawer, but the drawer was unlocked. It was always unlocked, the gunsmith had said. But Konstantin was a careful man with everything he owned. Why would the drawer containing the revolver be the exception? Volkov would never know. That was the kind of answer that goes to the grave with the question. He thought of Dostoevsky, of Raskolnikov, who had killed believing that crime could be justified by reason, and who had spent the rest of his life being destroyed from within until the only way out was confession. Of Sonia, who had endured the unendurable with a faith Raskolnikov could not comprehend. Of Dmitry Karamazov, condemned for a crime he had not committed, who had found, strangely, a greater freedom in condemnation than he had ever known in life. What had happened in the Merezhkov house was a story Dostoevsky could have written, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was profoundly, painfully common. A crime of convenience that had become a prison. A son who had spent his life serving the man who had destroyed his father, waiting for words that arrived too late. A guilty man who had tried for redemption and been stopped. A victim who had perhaps allowed the ending. And at the center of it all, a detective who had solved the case and could not feel that he had achieved justice. Perhaps because justice in this case was impossible. No sentence could restore 12 years of Grigory's life. No punishment could give Pavel back the childhood he had grown up without a father. No published confession could resurrect the dead man or erase the decades of silent complicity. What remained, the only concrete result of everything, was Pavel going to Siberia, as his father before him. The 30% fund waiting for him. Konstantin's confession, published months later, shaking families who slept in soft beds while the guilty parties of their own crimes still breathed, and the son of an innocent man serving the same sentence as his father for the opposite reasons. When he arrived home, Volkov sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea and looked out the window at the snow until the sun rose. On the shelf to his right was a row of books. Dostoevsky, all the major ones. He had read each of them at least twice. He stood, picked up Crime and Punishment, and placed it in the inside pocket of his overcoat. Not because he needed to reread it, but because there were cases that demanded to be carried. Not solved, not closed, but carried. As reminders that the distance between what is just and what happens is not a failure of the system. It is the human condition. Konstantin Merezhkov's confession was published in February of 1888. The scandal destroyed the reputations of two influential Saint Petersburg families and led to the review of 3 other cases tried by the same tribunal that had convicted Grigory Ivanovich. Too late for Grigory, but not too late for the others. Pavel Ilyich was tried and sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia. The same sentence, the same cold, the same fields his father had known as an innocent man. The 30% fund remained untouched for 8 years, administered by Father Alexei, accumulating interest Pavel had never asked for. When he was released in 1896, he was 48 years old. He was a free man and relatively wealthy, and he served no one for the rest of his life. No one ever knew if that was enough. Arkady Semyonovich Volkov retired 2 years later. He never spoke publicly about the Merezhkov case, but those who knew him said that in his final years of work, he had developed a new habit. At the close of each investigation, he would fall silent for a moment before signing the final papers, as though asking permission. From whom? No one could say.